In looking at the life of the Christ, we were looking at the world into which he was born, somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 BC, maybe 6. And we were looking at Judaism in particular. By the time of Jesus, time he was born, the tradition of the elders had been elevated above the Word of God. National Israel clung more to the tradition of the elders than they did the Word of God. Jesus addressed that in Matthew 15 and in Mark 7. The morning at 9 a.m. and evening at 3 p.m., daily sacrifices were being offered in the temple. And we go back to Exodus 29 for the law on that. The regular sacrifices of the law were offered at the temple. Leviticus 1 through 7, the 5 major sacrifices. That's the daily offerings and all of the other vow offerings, trespass offerings, thanks offerings that were offered all through the time under the law. The Day of Atonement was kept, Ethanim 10. We spend some time on that in Leviticus 16. The Feast of Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles were observed. The 3 major feasts at which all the Hebrew males and all those under the law were to appear in Jerusalem to observe these 3 feasts. The Feast of the Passover was observed on Nisan 14. Nisan is the word that later came to replace Abib in the Hebrew, Abib, and then Nisan, same month, 14th day. Matthew 26:17, we see that it was kept. And so that major feast is going to be important because Jesus observed the last lawful Passover under the law of Moses, Matthew 26, verse 17, make ready to eat the Passover. And during that Passover feast, he instituted the Lord's Supper, verses 26 through 28. So the bread that they would use would be Passover bread. That's how we know it's unleavened bread to use in the Lord's Supper. And the cup that they would use was the cup of the grape juice. That's how we know that we are to use grape juice in observing the Lord's Supper, because they were observing the Passover feast. Now, it was observed after the crucifixion of Jesus, but not lawfully, because the law of Moses ended on the day of Pentecost, when the law of Christ began. So after Acts 2, there was nothing in the temple as far as God was concerned. Judaism continued their rituals there. But there was no God in the Holy of Holies. There was no recognition, as far as heaven was concerned, of the Levitical priesthood. And therefore, anyone who obeyed the gospel and tried to go back and worship under Judaism was worshiping under an empty system. That would be true of the Ethiopian nobleman, though he had traveled perhaps more than 1,000 miles to come to Jerusalem to worship. His worship was empty because there was nothing in the temple. He didn't know that on his trip to Jerusalem. He learned it on his trip home when he obeyed the gospel. Then the Feast of Pentecost was being observed, Sivan or Sivan 6, Acts 2. Now when the day of Pentecost had fully come, that's 50 days after the waving of the offering after the Passover Sabbath. number 7 Sabbaths, that's 49 days, to the day after the 7th Sabbath, 50th day. Pentecost came then on the first day of the week. So when they were all together with one accord in one place, and the day of Pentecost had fully come, Acts 2:1, then we were at that annual feast. Now, Jews would come into Jerusalem for Passover. Now, they did not have travel like we have, so they didn't hop a jet, fly in for Passover, stay for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then fly home, and then a few days later hop a jet and fly back for Pentecost. Most of them came very long distances. So they were in Jerusalem for Passover. They would stay the 50-day time period to observe Pentecost. And that's how Josephus could account for, probably, he said, about 2 million people in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. Now that would let you see that 3,000 is not a big number comparatively. We get all excited because 3,000 were added together on the day of Pentecost and the church came into existence. But 3,000 out of 2 million is not a big number. And Jesus said, few there are that find it, Matthew 7:13 and 14. So that feast was still being observed, and that accounts for much of what you read after these people are baptized in Acts 2:38 and Acts 2:42. They continued. So a lot of these people who had come from long distances, prepared to stay from Passover to Pentecost, were not prepared to stay a long time after Pentecost. But they did. And thus the need arose that we need to help take care of these people. So we have what you read in Acts 2 and then in Acts 4. And then the Feast of Tabernacles, Ethanim 15-21, was being observed. John chapter 7 verse 2, and we looked at that last time. And then the Feast of Dedication was observed, John 10 and 22. And this is where we were ending as class expired. Feast of Dedication is not a feast under the law of Moses. It was not implemented with the 10 words in the book of the covenant in Exodus. We go to the intertestamental period for the Feast of Dedication. And this was after Antiochus IV Epiphanes had offered sow on the altar, taken the blood of that hog and splashed it on the walls of the temple, thus defiling the temple. And when the Jews got back in control and retook Jerusalem, the first thing they did was purify the temple. And when they had finished purifying it, they called it the Feast of Dedication. The dedication of the temple to God after being defiled by Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So this feast was observed, and Jesus went to this feast. It meant a great deal to the Jews. It would be somewhat similar to what 4th of July ought to mean to us. It was a great day to them, and so they observed that feast. And then the temple tax for the upkeep of the temple was paid. And that brings us to Matthew 17 and the 24th verse. The text says, when they had come to Capernaum, those who received, now you may have, I don't know what you have, possibly the tax, tribute money, any of that in italics? Money. You receive the tribute.
It says temple tax.
All right, the New King James, temple tax. Tribute money.
I lost where you were.
Matthew 17:24.
Okay, I'll put that 16, but I guess that's,
I would guess that would be a correct statement. Now, I'm just guessing, mind you.
Those who put the 2 drachma?
2 drachma, all right? Literally, the double drachma, which was a coin, an amount of money. And it is the temple tax. So the New American Standard did a literal translation there of the word, except it said, what drachma? 2, okay. The double drachma, 2 drachma. And you can look up your Bible, if you have a good study Bible, has a chart or a table of the value of money in that day. It's a guess for the most part, but it gives you an idea of what's involved. So when they came to Capernaum, those who received the tax, temple is in italics in the New King James, tribute.
I was in King James for where I do it during Wednesday night for the class.
Okay.
It says 2 drachma as well.
Okay. And any of that in italics?
No, it is not.
Okay. Any of it in italics in the New American Standard?
Tax is.
Okay. All right, so received
The American Standard says half shekel.
the half shekel, okay? So temple tax, the idea, that's the idea you need to get, the temple tax. It was a tax for the upkeep of the temple. Came to Peter and said, does your teacher not pay the tax? Your teacher does not pay the
Still it says tax there.
tax. Your teacher does not pay the same there, all right? All right, so here's that tax. Now, notice those who received the tax. So you had a tax collector. And they came to Peter and said, is your teacher not going to pay the tax? He's a Jew. And so they did so. You'll remember Jesus told him what to do. So the temple tax was still being collected when Jesus came. The high priest, and this is important, appointed by Rome, was in charge of the temple. Now, that's not lawful. The high priest was to succeed in the line of the high priest. But this again is why I covered with you material in the intertestamental period. That all changed with the coming in of especially the Grecian rule and especially that of the Seleucids with Antiochus and others. So the government began to appoint the high priest as to basically who bribed the official, who paid the highest price. And you could be high priest if you had the money. And that's what we're dealing with when Jesus comes. In fact, there are 2 high priests during the time of Jesus. That's not lawful. So you are dealing with this Roman rule. That's why I said Wednesday night, when I finished intertestamental period, chronologically, logically, we ought to have begun the study of the life of Christ. But I announced then that I really wanted to do that, teach it on Sunday morning and Wednesday night. But I did not want to put our teachers who have to teach one of those times and still want this material, want to be in class, at a disadvantage of missing half the classes. So I started Acts. Really didn't want to because it's out of my logical way of doing things. But you can see, I hope, why when you end the intertestamental period, you start the life of Christ. If you're going to deal with this in somewhat of a laid out chronological format. And so you have the high priest, and he's in charge of the temple. He presided over the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was composed of priests, scribes, and heads of families. And your Bible probably marks that Sanhedrin, and with a long E, and that's quite fine. We're talking about the same body of people. Most of you, I think I admitted even publicly I was crazy last week, so that is not a new admission. I appreciate those of you with good decorum not commenting on that publicly. But Sanhedrin, the body, the Supreme Court of the Jews. In Mark 14 and verse 53, they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. That made up the council, the Sanhedrin. So he's tried before Herod, he's tried before the Sanhedrin, he's tried before Pilate. And he goes through 7 mock trials during that period of time that he is under incarceration there. So they led Jesus there. So you are dealing with a Rome-appointed high priest and those who compose the council. The ordinary priest descended from Aaron. Hebrews 7:11 tells us that's the way it was supposed to be on the law. Were divided into 24 courses, and each served for a week at a time. At the great feast, all the priests, every course came together. It would take all the priests, 2.5 million people, if Josephus is right. It would take all the priests officiating to deal with that crowd. If you turn to Luke chapter 1, reference is made to the courses. In Luke chapter 1 and verse 5, there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias of now the New King James here says, division. Course. Of the course of Abijah. Now David divided the priest into courses. And you probably have a reference to 1 Chronicles 24. And we will jot back there briefly. Verse 1, 1 Chronicles. First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles.
Chapter 24.
Yes. There are 24 courses of the priests, 1 Chronicles 24. Now these are, the New King James says, divisions. Courses? Divisions. Of the sons of Aaron, so that would tell you that's the priests. The sons of Aaron were Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar. And Nadab and Abihu died before their father and had no children. You probably have a reference there to Leviticus 10. We won't get there this year on Winter Bible class. Maybe you'll hold out long enough. We'll get there eventually. Therefore, Eleazar and Ithamar ministered as priests. How many of you in your life as churchgoers, boys and girls coming up, heard of Nadab and Abihu? Any takers? I heard of Nadab and Abihu coming up. All right. How many of you heard of Ithamar and Eleazar? One? You scratching or raising? You scratching or raising?
I tried to remember.
You did? You must have been a fortunate young lady. Eleazar and Ithamar. We don't usually talk about them. Soapbox time. They're your important two priests because they carried on the priesthood. They down in the bayou got about 5 verses and a verse here or there, all referencing their disobedience. So Eleazar and Ithamar from Leviticus 10 forward carry on the priesthood. Ministered as priest. Then David with Zadok of the sons of Eleazar and Ahimelech of the sons of Ithamar divided them according to now the New King James says, schedule of their service. What do you have? Offices. Okay. Anyone different?
Duties in their service.
I'm sorry?
Duties in their service.
Duties in their service. Or I'm sorry to have to ask you to repeat, but that's where I am. So that's how they served, in these courses, in these divisions that David divided out. And this is what was taking place. And Zacharias is of the course of Abijah. And if you go on and read that chapter and the chapters that deal with the courses, he's of the 8th course. So they were in the 8th week of the service of the courses when Gabriel appeared to Zacharias and said, you're going to have a child. And he's ministering, and his lot that time was to go into the holy place and to burn the incense before the Lord. And so he's doing this while the people are praying, and Gabriel appears to him. The 8th course. Then drop down to verse 8. So it was that while he was serving as priest before God in the order of his division, Luke 1:8, according to the custom of the priesthood, his lot fell to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord, into the holy place, into the Naon, the sanctuary of the temple, not the most holy place. So it was his lot. That means they drew lots every morning as to what priest would do what that day. And you very seldom ever burned incense more than one time in your entire work. And this lot fell to him that day. Then verse 9, well, I read that. So here is what he is doing in his service. Now, it's very likely, you heard that, no definite, no dogmatism here. It's very likely that this explains something in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10. The parable of the Good Samaritan teaches, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This man, seeking to justify himself, said, and who is my neighbor? So Jesus told this parable in order to answer the question, who is my neighbor? So notice verse 30. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, down geographically from upper to lower, and fell among thieves, completely engulfed by thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, you have chance there? By chance, we would say it so happened. A certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. this priest and Levite being on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho may be an indication that one course of the priest had changed in Jerusalem. They had served their time and they were leaving, and another course was about to begin and they were coming. Now I'm saying this may explain why you would have a priest and a Levite arriving at the same place in proximity to each other. It may be the changing of the courses. We'll have to get to heaven to know for sure. Anyway, that was going on when Jesus came into the world. And the ordinary priests were serving at the temple. So these 8 things were happening when Jesus came to this earth. I will try to answer any questions. I like those, they're easy.
Going back to the temple, and you said that was Capernaum, correct? The temple in Capernaum, correct?
No, the temple's in Jerusalem.
Okay.
The temple tax was collected in the various cities,
Okay.
sent to Jerusalem. Thank you. Yes.
So if Romans had appointed the high priest, how could the faithful Jews worship God correctly if the priests were not correct?
They chafed under that, but they had no choice. If you were going to worship at all, you had to worship under the system that was in place. Now, how would you feel if you were a Jew trying to do that? You have an obligation to God, so you're going to fulfill that to the best of your ability and let God take care of what the government is doing as far as messing up the worship. You're going to do what you can do. So you could imagine they're chafing. They hated the Romans. They hated being in subjection. I would, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you? If these folks are trying to sell out our country to the Muslims, succeed, and they put Muslim law in place, wouldn't you hate to live under that arrangement? But you'd still try to worship God the very best you could. But it wouldn't be a pleasant situation. So that's a good point for you to keep in mind. Thank you for raising it, that it's not an ideal situation for these people. And we have brethren this morning that will worship somewhere in this world in secret, because if the government finds out they're meeting, they will kill them. No ifs, ands, and buts. I'd like some of our brethren to tell me why it's so hard for them to come to Bible class, when we have brethren who would put their lives on the line to sit in a class like this relaxed and study the Word of God. I'm off my soapbox. So, very good. Good question. Anyone else? Now, at this point, had I not already done so, I would hand out the handout that I handed out on Wednesday night, back during the intertestamental period, on the Pharisees and Sadducees. And I would encourage you to get your handout on them and study again the beliefs and so forth of the Sadducees and Pharisees. This is a little B on your outline now. Sadducees and Pharisees were prominent. The Sadducees usually supported the high priest appointed by Rome. So that tells you they're the political party. Whatever Rome says, yes sir, that's it, we're for it, let's go. Regardless whether it's right or wrong. There might have been caps floating around, make Rome great again. There might have been movement that said, whatever Rome says, don't question. It's right. It's right regardless. And that's the Sadducees. We'll play up to whatever party is in power because we want the power. And that's all for which we're concerned. Circle it. But the Pharisees often criticized the high priests, which was unlawful in and of itself. Remember, the law said, don't speak evil of a ruler of your people. So what I tried to stress to you on Wednesday nights when we studied Pharisees and Sadducees is this political tension and religious tension between the two sides. And notice this, they're all claiming to worship God under the same law. And yet both of them have self-interest at heart, not God. What's in it for me? What do I want? So you have this vying, Sadducees and Pharisees. Now, when you study the life of Christ, keep notes of the Pharisees sent. The Pharisees came. The Sadducees came. The Pharisees came. The Sadducees came. Back and forth trying to trap Jesus. To either turn the Jews against him or the Romans against him or both. So that's the world into which Jesus began his personal ministry. This political situations. The Sadducees control the temple. So that's how the Roman appointed high priest would be supported and encouraged. While the Pharisees dominated the synagogue. Now you have, or if you don't, it's up here, a handout on the synagogue. We're not yet ready to begin that, but I intend to cover that. And I hope you're studying ahead of me to get a feel for the synagogue. Now you have the temple going on, all these Jewish sacrifices, these people coming and going, but you also had synagogue worship in place. There's some debate as to when synagogue worship began. It seems to me it probably began under the Babylonian era. Some believe it did not begin until under the rule of Greece, and particularly the Seleucids from Syria. And they talk about the great synagogue that was involved. We talked about that a little bit on the intertestamental period. But when I get to the synagogue, I hope you are familiar with the outline. The Sadducees controlled the temple, the Pharisees dominated the synagogue, and most Jews, now look at this, came to be influenced by the teaching of the Pharisees. So when Jesus is in conflict with the Pharisees, they're trying to get him in conflict with the majority of the people, because the common people, the multitudes, would have been a better translation, were listening to Jesus freely. And the Pharisees were losing their following. Now remember, the Pharisees are those who seek to justify themselves, that they are righteous, and set all others at naught. You're nothing. You're not one of us. Now you imagine you're losing your following. Your congregation is dwindling, and you're not interested in their souls. You're not interested in their serving God. You're interested in your following and how much money that's going to make you. And here's this teacher now that's come into town, and all these people are leaving you and they're following him. Now you think about the animosity toward Jesus. And when you understand that situation, you understand why the Gospels read like they do, with this continual onslaught of the Pharisees against Jesus. They're influencing these common people, and the common people are now going toward Jesus. Little c, the Essenes, a sect of the Pharisees, were characterized by a desire for moral purity. The Pharisees were not interested in moral purity. They were interested in money, following, prestige, recognition. But these Essenes, who are a sect of the Pharisees, were interested in money. The Essenes opposed marriage and objected to the slaughter and eating of animals. They might have been members of that group that uses the acronym PETA in our society. Now, I think that stands for People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. In my world, it stands for people who enjoy eating tasty animals. So it depends on which side you're on that. But they would not worship according to the law because they didn't believe you ought to kill these animals. They didn't believe you ought to eat these animals. They lived in communities regulated by ascetic, self-defacing discipline. They'd beat themselves, try to beat the devils out of them. I've seen some people who need beating because the devil was in them, but I don't think you can beat the devil out of them. But they tried that. You've heard of that in some of the clusters of people who go to an extreme. I believe the book of Colossians deals with this to some degree. And so you have these people who refused to participate in animal sacrifices. Now, we didn't know so much about the Essenes until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. But the Dead Sea Scrolls give us a great deal of information about this community, this sect of the Pharisees, this division in the Pharisees called the Essenes. And if you'd like to pursue that, that would be a good study. They believed the system of worship was corrupt. They're true. That's right. They opposed high priests being appointed that did not descend from Zadok. Now go back to 1 Chronicles and in your study figure out from which of the two sons of Aaron did Zadok come, the Zadokites, that line of the priesthood. Go to Ezekiel 48. Ezekiel sees this new temple being built. It shall be, verse 11, for the priest of the sons of Zadok, who are sanctified, who have kept my charge, who did not go astray when the children of Israel went astray, as the Levites went astray. So here's a district being set aside for the Zadokites, the priests that came along, and these Essenes supported that line of the priest. If the high priest, they said, who officiated in the temple was corrupt, the whole system was corrupt. Well, would that be necessarily the case? I don't think so. If you had some people who were worshiping faithfully, that part of the system would be correct. But the part of the system that is political, affiliated with Rome, affiliated with whoever's in power, affiliated with just what gets me noticed, all that would be wrong. But you would always have the remnant. Don't ever lose sight of the remnant who would try to worship God according to the law. But these Essenes said, phooey on all of it. It's all corrupt. Now, aren't there people in our society who say the same thing about all government? Well, that's not a true statement. All government is not corrupt. I happen to know there are some Christians in government who are trying to get things right. They're working hard. We ought to pray for them and uphold them. Elect them if we can. They're not corrupt, but they're trying to right a corrupt system. And it didn't just get corrupt 5 years ago. It's been corrupt. We have too many Christians that politicize this thing. It depends on their party. And they refuse to look at the whole situation. It's not one man. It's not one person. It's not who's in this particular office. It's the character of the person and their relationship with God. Are they Christians? The Essenes just said, dump it all. The whole system's corrupt. We don't want to have anything to do with it. Not only that, they followed a different calendar than the Jews. The official temple calendar was a lunar calendar with the beginning of a month determined by the new moon. Remember Bible reference to new moons? Festivals on the new moons. The Essenes calendar was a solar calendar of 364 days divided in the months. So you have a different calendar, your feasts conflict each other. We're going to observe Feast of Tabernacle here. No, our calendar says observe it here. So you can see how the Essenes were out of step with even the Pharisees and Sadducees, though they're a sect of the Pharisees. All the important days were conflicted because of this. So you have these Essenes that are on the scene. And then, little d, you have the zealots. What word do you see in zealots? Zeal. And do you know what zeal means? What the inference is there?
On fire.
On fire. Who said that? Good. On fire. You're zealous. All right? These folks are on fire for something. If you turn to Luke 6, and verse 15, the 12 apostles, Matthew and Thomas, James of Alphaeus, and Simon called what? The Zealot. Everybody have the zealot there? Okay. The zealot, all right? Here's one of the apostles that's a zealot. Turn to Acts 1. All right, Simon the Zealot, Luke chapter 6. Now, Acts 1 and verse 13. When they had entered, they went up into the upper room where they were staying. Peter, James, John, and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James of Alphaeus, and Simon, you have the zealot there, and Judas of James. All right, the zealot. Now, that's an offshoot of the Pharisees, and they became fanatics, a fanatical movement that refused to recognize any legal authority. No king but the Lord was their cry. So we don't serve anybody but the Lord. True or false? That would put you in conflict with the Lord. Sir? Why is that true? That is true. Why? All right, be in subjection to every power, for the powers that are what? Ordained of God. God set civil government in place. It's one of His institutions. So they said, we don't serve anybody. Is it wrong for us to submit to the civil government? Is it?
Only if it goes against God's.
The answer to that broad question is what? No. It's right for us to submit to the civil government. But there's one exception. Anytime civil government conflicts or contradicts the law of God, we have to say, no, we won't go. No, I won't go. So these zealots said, we don't serve any government. This rebellion against Roman authority was a primary cause of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. These uprisings by these zealots, they were fanatics. Now, do you know, are y'all aware, what's the first three letters of fanatic? F-A-N. And what's that spell? Are there any fanatics that wear orange? Any fanatics that wear crimson? Any fanatics that are from one of them states up north? Any fanatics? You know, we call ourselves fans. Well, that's from the word fanatic. Have you ever been around some of them? They can be fanatic, can't they? Well, now you take that enthusiasm, zealous, and bring it over into this realm of what Jesus faced. We don't submit to any government. We don't submit to the religious government. And you see, Jesus dealt with Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and zealots. How would you like to come into that world and try to teach, bring people to God? Thank you for listening.